What's up guys, Retro Gamer Gen X back with another episode, and in this episode we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the history of video game consoles and retro computers. Basically what this video is just a compilation of all my look at history sections that I did throughout the year of 2022, and I compiled them into one big video here. And they'll be all in separate chapters as well that you can look below and go to your favorite video game system and learn the history of that if you wanted to, or you could watch the whole thing as well too, or you can skip through it however you want, but the chapters are down below. This will range everything from like the Atari 2600 up to the N64, so from the 1970s up until the 1990s. So it's a really cool video, guys. Just kind of take a look at it. Now, in between each of the systems, I do put a commercial for that system in there as well, because I know the commercials are kind of popular in the channel. People like watching those old commercials, so I did include at least one commercial for each system as well in between. So without further ado, guys, let's go ahead and take a look at the history here.
Out here we entertain ourselves at home, so we got an Atari video game. There's so many different games to play. We especially like Space Invaders, zapping those little devils from outer space. It's fun, but personally I think the whole idea of creatures from outer space is a little far-fetched.
No other company offers you as many different video game cartridges as Atari.
The story of the Atari 2600 really starts in 1972 when Nolan Bushnell and Ted Danby formed Atari Incorporated. During this time, Atari produced arcade game hits like Pong, but by 1974, Atari had realized they needed to get into the home market. At this point, Atari acquired Cyan Engineering, and with that acquisition, brought on engineers Ron Milner and Steve Mayer. Also in 1975, after the acquisition of Cyan Engineering, the two engineers, Mayer and Milner, met with MOS technology that was recently purchased by Commodore Incorporated. They spoke with Chuck Peddle, and he advised them that they could sell them the 6502 microprocessor for a price of $25 per unit. Unfortunately for Atari, this price was still too high for the consumer market. At this point, Mayer, Milner, and Peddle all sat down and basically came up with the design of the 6507 processor for Atari's use. This is a cost-reduced version of the processor which has less address lines and a smaller footprint and a smaller cost, as MOS offered the chip to Atari for a price of $12 per unit. Also with the deal would be bundled in for an additional $12 per unit, the MOS Riot chip, the RAM input-output timer chip. Atari struck the deal and the development of the 2600 started. In late 1975, Atari hired Joe Decor to help design the graphics chip for the new game console. The first prototype, which was named Stella, had the 6507 processor, the Riot chip, and a breadboard version of the graphics chip known as Stella at the time, which would eventually become the television interface adapter. Now, a second version of this prototype was completed by March 1976 with the help of Miner. They actually incorporated the chip called the television interface adapter, or TIA chip, into the design. In 1976, unfortunately, Atari was experiencing financial woes. By this point, due to the development of the Atari 2600 or VCS system, its Pong console, and its arcade divisions, Atari was millions of dollars in debt and needed financial help. At this point, Bushnell agreed to the terms for Warner Communications to purchase Atari Incorporated. On June 4th, 1977, the Atari VCS was debuted at the Consumer Electronics Show, and by September 1977, the Atari VCS launched at a price of $199. By 1978, Bushnell and Warner Communications were in disagreements about how the Atari 2600 should be marketed. Nolan Bushnell at this point decided to step away from Atari. Between 1978 and 1983, Warner Communications had great success with the Atari VCS or 2600 system. Unfortunately, by 1983, due to really poor games being dumped on the Atari system, the video game crash occurred. At this point, Warner was losing money at Atari and decided to sell. In 1984, Atari was sold to ex-Commodore founder Jack Tramiel. During Jack's reign at Atari, we saw the last iteration of the Atari 2600 released in 1986, the one that we know as the Atari Junior. This was produced until 1992, giving the Atari an amazing 15-year run, the most of any video game console.
I'll try almost anything. So when Mattel Electronics asked me to compare their Intellivision games with Atari, I gave it a try. I compared Atari baseball with Intellivision and found Intellivision played much more like real baseball. Then I compared Atari football with Intellivision. Again, Intellivision played more like the real game. In my opinion, if you try them both, there's only one conclusion you can come to. Intellivision from Mattel Electronics.
The story of the Intellivision started in 1977. At this time, Mattel had started the Mattel Electronics division to produce the handheld electronic games and started the development of the Intellivision. Mattel wanted something that was better than what the competition had at the time, so they started working with APH Technological Consulting and started shopping for a chipset for the new console. First, they worked with National Semiconductor to get a powerful chipset, but they deemed this chipset too expensive. At about the same time, APH consulted with General Instruments. They were interested in the General Instruments chipset named Gemini. The only problem with this chipset is that it didn't have reprogrammable graphics. General Instruments worked with Mattel to create a custom chipset just for Mattel's new game system. Because Mattel had basically went with National Semiconductor first, they waited 2 months before actually closing the deal with General Instruments for their new chipset. A team of engineers at Mattel, headed by David Chandler, began work on the development of the hardware. Then in 1978, David Roth of APH developed the exec program that was used to execute the game programs. Also, with a group of students from Caltech, they started designing the first games for the Intellivision. The Intellivision was debuted at the 1979 Las Vegas CES show in January. The Master Component System was debuted at a starting price of $165, with the soon-to-follow keyboard component at the same price of $165. At the Chicago CES show in June, those prices were actually revised to $250 for each unit. This was due to a shortage of chips that were needed for both components. In the fall of 1979, GTE started selling its own branded version of the Intellivision, licensed from Mattel, and they started selling these units in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. at its GTE stores at a price of $280. Mattel started distributing consoles to Godluck's department store with a suggested retail price of $275. It was also put into the JCPenney 1979 Christmas catalog. Also listed were 7 cartridges with the Master Component System being priced at $249. By 1981, 19 cartridges were produced by APH Technologies and the students from Caltech. And with the success of these cartridges, Mattel wanted to have their own in-house programmers, codenamed the Blue Sky Rangers. And to keep these programmers from being hired away by the likes of Atari, Mattel kept their identities and their work locations private. In the spring of 1983, Mattel introduced the Intellivision 2, which was a smaller, compact version of the Intellivision, and it was cost reduced to save Mattel money and bring a lower price to the consumer. As we all know, the video game crash came in 1983, and Mattel saw the losses coming as well. During 1983 and 1984, most of the staff from Intellivision Electronics Division was laid off. And on November 4th, 1984, Mattel sold the Intellivision business to the INTV Corporation, which was led by former Mattel's Electronics Senior Vice President of Marketing, Terrence Valinsky. At first, INTV Corporation sold the remaining inventory of the Intellivision games and consoles. Then they produced what was known as the INTV-3, a rebranded original Intellivision. This was produced until 1990, when the Intellivision finally reached the end of its lifespan. This gave the Intellivision an 11-year run with 2 different companies. Sales of the unit are vague. when Mattel had control of the company, they had sold a little less than 3 million units from 1979 to 1983. Unfortunately, I could not find sales figures for the time that the INTV Corporation sold a unit, so I'm not quite sure how many units were sold in total.
Arcade players, get ready. The new Atari 5200 Super System is here. With a controller so advanced it plays arcade. Graphics so real it looks arcade. With arcade hits you can't play on any other system. No other home video system can touch it. The new Atari 5200 Super System. It's as good as you are, maybe even better. Next time.
In late 1977, Atari had already been purchased by Warner Communications. Go ahead and click the link above, or I'll post a link below as well, and watch my Atari 2600 A Look At video. It has an in-depth history of Atari from Pong to the Atari 2600. The story of the 5200 starts after that. Nolan Bushnell was still with the company, and Warner Communications had already started the successor of the 2600, and there was actually talks of them discontinuing it. Bushnell disagreed with this, and along with other issues that he had with Warner Communications, he decided to leave the company. That's how I'm going to tell it. Warner would probably tell it a different way, but I'm taking Bushnell's side of this story. Warner started development of the successor to the 2600, but 1977 is known as the year of the personal computer revolution. This is the year that the Apple II, Commodore PET, and the TRS-80 launched, bringing the personal computer to many homes and businesses. Atari had seen this and wanted in on the lucrative personal computing market, so instead of developing the next video game system, they used the technology to develop the Atari 8-bit line of computers. Now at this time, the only real competition that Atari had was the Fairchild Channel F, the Bally Astrocade, and the Magnavox Odyssey 2. But fast forward a couple years, and Mattel had released the Intellivision in 1979, and in 1982, Coleco released the Colecovision, both of which had add-ons that could play the Atari 2600 cartridges and had superior graphics to the 2600. Atari knew that they had to do something, and they unshelved the console prototype from 1978. They developed it into the Atari Video System X, which a few prototypes were actually made. The name was changed to the Atari 5200. The 5200 was officially launched in November of 1982. Atari had released a decently powerful video game console to compete with the Coleco and Intellivision. However, the timing was completely wrong. The controllers were horrible, and the games were just the same old arcade ports like on the Atari 2600. And it wasn't backwards compatible with the 2600, nor was it compatible with the 8-bit line of computers. And because of this, consumers just couldn't justify the cost of buying a new game console for the same old games, but with a little bit better graphics, and of course it had the bad reputation for the controllers as well. After its release, it did sell a few units, but it did not meet Atari's sales expectations. Atari had even gone as far as designing a slim version of the Atari 5200 called the Atari 5200 Junior or the 5100. However, since sales were slow, this project was canceled. A few of those prototypes do exist, and they're out there in the wild as well. And then in 1983, the video game crash came, and sales of the system plummeted, along with the sales of the Atari 2600. Atari discontinued the 5200 in May of 1984, giving it a lifespan of only 18 months. And shortly after this, Warner Communications sold Atari to Jack Tramiel. The 5200 just sold over 1 million units. Although it was a powerful machine, it was not a success for Atari.
Now you can bring the arcade experience home. Introducing ColecoVision, the most advanced video game system you can buy. It plays more games than any other system. Arcade games with multiple screens like Donkey Kong. Arcade games like Zaxxon with its three-dimensional look. Adventure with 15 different screens. Cosmic Avenger. And ColecoVision's new Smurf game. Coming soon. ColecoVision's first expansion module that lets you play all the Atari VCS compatible cartridges. Now you can bring the arcade experience home because your vision is our vision. ColecoVision.
The story of the ColecoVision really started in 1932. This is when Maurice Greenberg opened the Connecticut Leather Company. They started producing leather goods and leather shoe repair kits. During World War II, the demand for business grew, and so did the company. In the early 1950s, Maurice Greenberg's son, Leonard Greenberg, joined the company. It was his idea to sell leather lacing and leather craft kits to children. At a 1954 toy fair, their leather moccasin kit was chosen as the Child Guidance Prestige toy, and at this point, the Connecticut Leather Company decided to go full-on in kids' toys. In 1956, Leonard Greensburg bought a technology used to vacuum form plastic, which led the company to develop several small toys made out of plastic, including wading pools. In 1961, the leather and shoe finding portion of the business was sold off, and the Connecticut Leather Company abbreviated its name to Coleco. In 1963, Coleco acquired the Kestrel Corporation, which was a leading manufacturer of vinyl pools and toys. After this acquisition, Coleco became the largest manufacturer of above-ground swimming pools in the world. In 1966, the company had grown so large that Leonard persuaded his brother Arnold Greensburg to join. After Arnold joined, several other toy manufacturing companies were acquired by Coleco. Coleco enjoyed success during the late 1960s in the toy manufacturing sector. In 1971, Coleco became public on the New York Stock Exchange, and then Coleco acquired a snowmobile company. After the acquisition of the snowmobile company, sales were very poor in that sector. Coleco had to find a way to make money and make money fast. Right around this time, Arnold Greensburg was named CEO of the company and wanted to get into the growing video game market. Coleco in 1976 started producing the Telstar dedicated game consoles. Nearly all of these dedicated systems were built around a General Instruments Pong on a chip, which there was a shortage of, but since Coleco was one of the first to order, they got their entire shipment while other companies didn't. This made Coleco a leader in the dedicated game console market in the 1970s. The sales of the dedicated game consoles allowed Coleco to break even with the failing snowmobile business. Coleco did well in the electronics video game market and wanted to continue their success. In 1979, Arnold Greensburg wanted to create a programmable home video game console with arcade-quality games made with off-the-shelf parts. Eric Bromley and his engineering team began the design of the Colecovision. In 1979, they had already developed a prototype system that used a Texas Instruments chip for the video and a General Instruments chip for the audio, but because of the cost of RAM at the time, it was not approved, but shelved and perhaps for a later date. By early 1982, that later date had come, and the cost of RAM had fallen, and Bromley saw that the cost of the system was well within what Coleco wanted. Development of the Colecovision was very fast, as the system was already developed and was just shelved. The Colecovision was launched on August of 1982, and by Christmas of 1982 had already sold 500,000 units. In early 1983, more than 1 million units had already been sold, greatly surpassing what the biggest rival, the Atari 5200, was doing. Sales were looking good, and Coleco decided to launch the Coleco Atom computer. Unfortunately, this was the beginning of the end for Coleco. The Atom was not a success due to bad manufacturing and defects, which gave Coleco a bad name. And then it happened, the video game crash. With horrible sales of the Atom computer and the Colecovision sales plummeting along with the sales of its games, by 1985, Coleco had announced the discontinuation of the Atom computer and in October of the Colecovision. This gave the Colecovision a 37-month run, selling just under 2 million units in that time frame. Unfortunately for Coleco, their timing was just bad when they released it right before the video game crash. Had they released it in 1979, we might still be playing Coleco video game systems today. Nobody would question the quality of the graphics and the games of the Colecovision, far beating what Atari or any other video game system at the time could do. Just another example of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, Coleco went on to produce the Cabbage Patch Doll, which kind of kept them afloat for a few more years, but by 1988, Coleco had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and by 1989, what was left of Coleco was swallowed up by the toy giant Hasbro.
Adventure is on the horizon. Stanley's going buggy. Mario Brothers have their hands full, and Donkey Kong's going ape. It's rough seas for Popeye, and Snoopy's got to get on the ball. But you can help. You got Nintendo Game & Watch. That's pocket power. Widescreen or multi-screen games you can play indoors or out. They tell you the score and even the time. They're pocket power. They're Game & Watch. 14 in all, only from Nintendo.
The story of the Game & Watch starts in the 1970s when game designer Gunpei Yokoi, head of Nintendo's research and development of its toys and games division, took a train ride home and noticed a businessman on the train playing with a calculator. This is when the thought came to his head that he could make a game out of calculator parts. An affordable electronic game that you can use to kill time while waiting in line or on train rides seemed like a perfect idea. When he got back to Nintendo, he pitched the idea to Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi. After the pitch, Yamauchi asked Yokoi to chauffeur him to a business meeting. I'm sure that request seemed odd, but Yokoi obliged. It turns out that the business meeting was with the CEO of Sharp, and Yamauchi wanted Yokoi to pitch his idea at this meeting. Nintendo and Sharp struck a deal to use Sharp's SN500 series 4-bit microcontrollers for this project. Yokoi had full control over the development. He wanted a game controller kind of like the arcade, and actually developed the D-pad. Before long, the first Game & Watch game was made, named Ball. It was a simple game just juggling balls on the LCD screen. This was the first of 60 games to be released on the platform. Nintendo has stated that it used the profit off the Game & Watches to develop the Famicom, which here in the US we all know as the NES, or the Nintendo Entertainment System. And without development of that system, Nintendo might not be the powerhouse they are today, and video game history may have been completely changed. With a launch date in 1980, and it being discontinued in 1991, the Game & Watch series had a successful 11-year run. During that time, Nintendo sold 43.3 million of these units, making it the Kickstarter for the Nintendo Entertainment System and for the Nintendo Corporation as a whole.
What's it like to play the Nintendo Entertainment System? Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.
The NES story starts in the arcades of the early 1980s. Nintendo's success with games such as Donkey Kong led to Nintendo's president Hiroshi Yamauchi to call for a game console based on arcade machines like Galaxian and Donkey Kong. Originally, it was supposed to be a 16-bit home computer with floppy drives and a keyboard, but Yamauchi rejected this plan. He wanted a cheaper system that people didn't need to be technophiles to be able to use. At this point, Masuki Yorama, and I'm sorry if I'm getting the pronunciations of these names wrong, they're a little hard, began the design by October of 1982 and had a test model or prototype built. However, no programming tools were available, so programming started on an NEC PC8001 computer, so basically the PC88, connected to a whole bunch of LEDs, a grid of LEDs really, to create the graphics for the games. The project was named Gamecom, but this name was actually changed to Famicom with a suggestion by Yorama's wife. Now, the Famicom was heavily influenced by the Colecovision. Nintendo saw how much better the games looked on the Coleco as opposed to like an Atari 2600 and that. So they really thought that they would be competing with Coleco in the future and wanted to come up with something that could produce arcade quality graphics. The console was released on July 15th, 1983, only in Japan, with 3 games being released with the system at the time: Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. The console released with some issues. Due to some manufacturing defects, there were some issues with the chips inside that caused the system to crash. But after a recall, the Famicom enjoyed success, much success, and by 1984 it was the best-selling console in Japan. Also in 1984, Nintendo agreed to have third-party publishers make games on it. These first two publishers were Namco and Hudson Soft. They agreed to a deal for a 30% fee to Nintendo for console licensing and production cost. And honestly, this was an industry standard in the video game market up until 2010. Now, Nintendo had its sights on North America. However, they were still skeptical of going into that market alone. And in 1983, Nintendo started negotiations with Atari to market the Famicom under Atari's name in North America. The deal was supposed to be signed at the CES show in 1983. However, Atari saw a Nintendo Donkey Kong cartridge being used and displayed in a Coleco display. And basically at that point, they nixed the deal with Nintendo.
Okay, whoa. I'm going to go ahead and stop right here. So let's think if this deal would have went through with Atari. The implications it would have had in the gaming industry today. I mean, it really would have been kind of crazy because Nintendo probably wouldn't have been the superstar that it is today. Which means that Sony wouldn't have worked with Nintendo on the Super NES add-on CD system, which probably wouldn't have been the PS1. There's so many different things. And then Atari actually making that deal and making all that money and becoming a super giant in the gaming industry again instead of basically faltering away. Man, just think of the implications of all that. And Trammell not buying Atari. Oh, yeah, there's definitely... It's like a whole alternate universe, guys. Bizarro fucking retro world. Alright, let's get back to the history.
Now at that point, Nintendo decided to go for it on their own. The first idea was to package it as the Nintendo Advanced Video Game System, or AVS. This would include a repackaged Famicom, a keyboard, a cassette data recorder, a wireless joystick, and a basic ROM cartridge. Nintendo did decide against this as it would be too expensive for regular consumers, and with the game crash, they were worried that the console and computer just wouldn't sell. So Nintendo first used the Famicom hardware in North America in the Versus arcade cabinets. This was basically just a test to see how gamers would react to what was really a home video game system in this cabinet. It was a huge success. The Versus system became the highest grossing arcade cab by 1985. With this, Nintendo went ahead and designed the North American Famicom system. The system would have a front-loading assembly that resembled a VCR for user familiarity. It also helped prevent ESD, or electronic static discharge, in dry climates like Nevada and Arizona. The new case was designed by Lance Barr. At this point, the Nintendo AVS system was renamed to the Nintendo Entertainment System. The change came due to Nintendo wanting to distance itself from the video game market, essentially after the crash. And that's why it's not called the Nintendo Video Game System. It released in 2 test markets, in New York City in October of 1985 and in Los Angeles in February 1986. It was very successful in those markets. So Nintendo decided to release the NES nationwide on September 27, 1986. Now, as technology advanced, obviously game consoles are going to be discontinued. Now, the NES was discontinued in 1995, basically giving it a 9-year run in the North American market. Now, the Famicom, on the other hand, was discontinued in the year 2000. So that really gave that console a 17-year run on the market in Japan. So my last video, I said the Atari with its 15-year run was the longest console. Apparently I was mistaken. It actually is the Famicom at 17 years. Over the course of its lifespan and all the different iterations of it, the Famicom, the Nintendo, it did sell about 62 million units.
Sega challenges you with the ultimate video game, the Sega Master System, with twice as much memory as any other video game. Advanced video technology like scrolling backgrounds, graphics in 64 colors, digital sounds,
and light phasers. And you can add to the excitement with sports pads, control sticks, and the first video games ever in 3D.
Sega's the one.
The Sega Master System. The challenge will always be there.
The story of the Sega Master System really starts in 1983 with the release of its first game console, the SG-1000 in Japan. It was released on the same day as Nintendo's Famicom, but unfortunately did not see the success that Nintendo did. In 1984, Sega's parent company, Gulf and Western Industries, divested in non-core businesses, including Sega. Sega now owned itself and put Nakayama as the CEO of the newly founded Sega Enterprises. Also in 1984, Sega released another console called the SG-1000 Mark II. This featured several hardware revisions and also a detachable controllers from the system. Then in 1985, Sega released the Sega Mark III, which was another redesign of the SG-1000. It was engineered by Hideki Soto and Masami Ishiwaka. According to Soto, the console was designed due to the limitations of the SG-1000's GPU, and they wanted something that would be able to compete with the graphics of the Nintendo, so they designed a new graphics chip based on the Sega System 2 arcade board. The Mark III was released in October of 1985 in Japan only, but had problems finding publishers due to the licensing agreements that Nintendo had already set up with most companies. And once again, Sega had a console that was not very successful in Japan. Sega knew they had a great video game system and wanted to release it worldwide to compete with the likes of Nintendo and Atari. In 1986, Sega formed Sega of America with Bruce Lorry, Nintendo of America's former vice president of sales, heading this group. Rebranded as the Master System, the system itself was redesigned, appealing more to the American market. It was first revealed in the summer CES show in Chicago in 1986. The console itself was launched in September of 1986 at a price of $200 in the United States. Sega hoped to sell more than 700,000 units by the end of 1986, but unfortunately their projections fell short, only selling 125,000 units. While Nintendo, at the same point, sold more than 1.1 million units. Just like in Japan, Nintendo had licensing agreements with most American publishers, leading to Sega to develop pretty much their own game library and not having the help of third-party developers. In 1987, Sega sold the distribution rights to the Master System to toy company Tonka. Nintendo had marketed the Nintendo Entertainment System as a toy, so Sega felt that if they marketed it with a toy company, it might increase sales. But Tonka already purchased Kenner Toys in 1987, and after a horrible Christmas season, funds were running low for Tonka. And in 1988 there was an EEPROM shortage, and Tonka did not want to buy the more expensive EEPROMs, not being able to distribute very many games for the Master System, further decreasing sales. Also in 1987, the Mark III was re-released as the Master System in Japan, as also did not sell very well. Now Sega had to move to more markets. They closed the deal in 1987 to have the Master System distributed by Mastertronic in the United Kingdom. Advance orders of the system were very high, but unfortunately the demand was not met as units were not made until Boxing Day, making shipments late. Mastertronic sold the rest of their shares to Virgin to form Virgin Mastertronic, which took over all European distribution in 1988. By 1990, the Master System was the best-selling console in Europe, selling more than 918,000 consoles, greater than Nintendo's 655,000 units. This had European developers pushing to develop on the console, unlike in Japan or the United States. The Sega Master System was also very successful in Brazil, being marketed by Tectoy. The Sega Master System, although not initially successful, did enjoy success in Europe and Brazil and other parts of the world. Being released in Japan in 1985 and being discontinued in Brazil in 1998 gave the console an amazing 13-year run, with worldwide sales between Sega and Tectoy ranging between 20 to 21 million units.
And now the best new rock performer of the year is...
Stevie Palmer.
Thank you very much. Oh my gosh, did he get over here? Isn't that your next door neighbor?
What a surprise. I'd like to thank my agent, my arranger, and Sheena, the girl next door.
The Amiga computer. Professional video production at amateur prices.
Stevie, you rodent.
Amiga from Commodore. The computer for the creative mind.
For the history of the Amiga, I could literally sit here and spend an hour just talking about the development and the people involved and the chipset It'd be way too long and drawn out of a video, so I'm gonna do a condensed version, so all you Amiga fans just kind of bear with me. I'm trying to fit this all into like a 15 to 20 minute video, so we'll see how that goes. Now, if you guys watched my Atari 2600 video, you would recall Jay Miner that designed the TIA chip. Well, he ended up leaving Atari in 1979 after Bushnell left and Warner took over. Miner wanted to develop a next generation console using the Motorola 68000 CPU, and Atari wanted to live in the past, still using a 6502 base processor for their next console. Later that year, Larry Kaplan left Atari and also went on to form Activision. Kaplan was then approached by some investors who wanted to develop a new game system. Kaplan hired Miner and formed a company called High Toro. They started to develop a system codenamed Lorraine. Kaplan left the company in 1983 and Miner was promoted to chief engineer and the company was renamed to Amiga. By 1983, a breadboard version of Lorraine was created and it was ready to be shown at the 1984 CES show. During the demonstration, they didn't have an operating system ready yet, so they created a 3D bouncing red and white ball, the Amiga logo we all know and love today. Unfortunately, even though it was an advanced system, it really didn't catch on. Only one company showed interest in it, and that was Atari. Now, by this point, Amiga was running out of funds and needed some quick cash. Talks were ongoing with Atari, and Atari loaned Amiga $500,000. Now this loan was short term and had to be paid by the end of the month, and if it wasn't paid, then Atari would own the rights to the Lorraine system. Now this is kind of where the story gets interesting. Now in 1983, Atari lost over $1 million in 1 week due to the video game crash, and basically was just siphoning off money left and right. Warner wanted out at this time. Now in 1984, Jack Tramiel resigned from Commodore, and a lot of engineers went with him, and they went to Atari and started to develop their own 68000 base series computer. So this is where basically the two timelines meet. So Atari needs a 68000 base series computer, and Amiga's got one, and Amiga's broke, and Atari thinks they have the deal done with a loan Amiga couldn't pay back. This is when Commodore stepped up. Commodore paid off the loan to Atari. Then they initially tried to complete a $4 million deal for licensing the Amiga, but then they just basically offered to buy the company outright for $24 million. Amiga agreed to that, and the rest is pretty much history. Now by this time, the breadboard prototypes of the chipset were now in IC form. In 1985, Commodore released it as the Amiga from Commodore, but that name was later changed to the Amiga 1000. Now unfortunately for Commodore, sales of the system weren't very good. They were selling, but they just weren't really good. But they had basically went all in on Amiga. So CEO of Commodore, Thomas Radigan, decided to release two versions of the Amiga as a marketing tactic. One was a high-end system that had major amounts of expansion, basically more for video audio production for professionals. The other version of this computer, using the same chipset but on a cost-reduced motherboard, was to be released for the low-end market. Those two machines were the Amiga 2000 and the Amiga 500. Both being released in 1987 and went on to become very successful machines. But the Amiga 500 sold many more units. The A500 went on to be the best-selling Amiga computer Commodore produced, selling between 4 and 5 million units.
And so it was, late in the 20th century, that a pox fell upon the land, a plague of home videos that were limited in intelligence. There was brain drain, and terminal boredom swept the countryside. The maker looked down and was not pleased by what he saw, and said, "This is not good." And so it was, he brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the intelligence, twice the challenge, twice the fun. Only a chosen few were called forth to experience this new dimension of high-definition graphics and stereo sound. And the makers saw what he had done and said, now that's not bad. Discover Genesis, and your world will never be the same.
The story of the Sega Genesis actually started in the early 1980s. Sega's arcade sales were starting to slump, and they saw the need to get into the home console market. The push to get into the home console market was led by Sega Enterprises Limited president Hayao Nakayama. So in 1983, Sega released the SG-1000 in Japan only, but the system didn't fare well against Nintendo's Famicom. In 1984, Sega arranged a buyout with their owner, Gulf Western, which Sega was a subsidiary of, and Nakayama was named president of the newly formed Sega Enterprises. Within 2 years of the SG-1000's release, Sega released another console named the Mark III. Now, we all in North America know the Mark III as the Sega Master System, which was released here in the United States in 1986 to compete with Nintendo in the American market. However, just like in Japan, unfortunately, the Master System wasn't very successful, which Sega already anticipated, and within just a few days of launching the Master System in the United States, work already began on a new console with two of Sega's best R&D engineers at the helm, Hideki Sato and Masumi Ishikawa. But in 1987, another stroke of bad luck hit Sega. NEC, one of Japan's biggest electronic companies, decided to launch the PC Engine. Sega at this point saw the need for a 16-bit system because of the release of the PC Engine and rumors of a 16-bit console being developed by Nintendo. So the decision was made by Ishikawa to develop a system with a 16-bit microprocessor and a second 8-bit Zilog coprocessor to help take the load off the main processor for the system sound. The exterior design of the Megadrive was actually trying to emulate audio equipment of the time and also the interior of automobiles. This decision was made to distance itself from toy-looking consoles, hoping to attract older consumers. The Megadrive was released in Japan on October 29, 1988. Unfortunately for Sega, its release was 1 week after Super Mario Bros. 3 was released on the Nintendo, and with the PC Engine being very popular in Japan as well, Sega was running a distant third in the console race in Japan. Sega now knew at this point it needed to act in North America, and fast. Tonka, an American toy company, was marketing the Master System for Sega at the time, but Sega was not impressed by their marketing tactics, so for the Sega Genesis they decided to seek help from another company. Sega then contacted Atari and made a proposal with CEO Jack Tramiel, but Tramiel refused the offer, instead deciding to work on the Atari ST line of computers. So at this point, Sega basically said screw everybody and opened its own Sega of American division to handle marketing and distribution of the Sega Genesis. The Genesis launched to a limited market just like the NES did previously. This was done to test the American market before a full release. It was launched in New York City and Los Angeles on August 14, 1989. And due to the successful sales of the console, it was released to the rest of the United States later that year in several batches. And Sega, in different parts of the world, decided to distribute the market through different companies as well. It was released in Europe and Brazil in September of 1990, and in other parts of the world with different distributors on various dates. Marketing in North America was handled by former Atari Corporation Entertainment Electronics Division President Michael Katz. He wanted to market the system for its arcade-like gameplay and graphics, and came up with the slogan, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." But by mid-1990, Katz did not reach the sales goal by Nakayama for 1 million units, and only 500,000 were sold. So at this point, Nakayama fired and replaced him with Tom Kalinske. He saw that Nintendo was successful with having an iconic video game character like Mario, and wanted to repeat that kind of success. At this point, Sega's mascot was Alex the Kid. Although popular in Japan, in the North American market, nobody really knew him and didn't relate to the character. Sonic was made to show the speed and graphic capabilities of the Genesis, along with being a cool character, as Sega was trying to reach a cooler crowd of gamers. The strategy worked and sales of the Genesis increased. Other marketing techniques were put in place, like reducing the cost of the console, hiring developers that targeted American audiences, and a very aggressive ad campaign. Sega was also successful on creating different add-ons for the system as well. With the addition of the power-based converter, 32X, and the Sega CD, Sega had reached the 32-bit and CD-ROM game market, and having backward capability to the Master System helped sales of the old Master System games as well. Sega also showed their hand in the rating system for video games. In the early to mid-1990s, watchdog groups were condemning video games for the violence that they portrayed. Sega even went to congressional hearings because of games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. During these proceedings, the video game rating system was set up, and by December of 1994 was being put on video games. But since there was a rating system now, Sega decided to release Mortal Kombat 2 completely uncensored, and not having to use a code to get the blood and fatalities like in the original Mortal Kombat. So they were really the first to test the system, and it worked, as we can see by the games that are released today. Sega discontinued the Genesis in 1997, selling over 30 million units worldwide. Another 4.5 million units were sold by other distribution companies worldwide as well, bringing the total to about 35 million consoles. With most of these sales being in North America and Europe, Sega finally achieved success in the home console market with help of great marketing and one little hedgehog.
How do you believe your system is the most advanced in the universe? Let's review the numbers. Sega Genesis is 16 bits. 3DO is 32 bits. The Atari Jaguar is 64 bits. Which is more advanced? Clifford! 16 and 32 are less than 64. So with 64 bits, 3D graphics, real-world animation, and lightning speed that you can only get with Jaguar, which is more advanced? Clifford!
Can you repeat the question?
Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
The story of the Jaguar actually starts in the mid-1980s with 4 different companies: Atari, Commodore, Sinclair, and Flare Technologies. Commodore's longtime president, Jack Tramiel, jumped ship from Commodore to Atari in 1984. At this point, Tramiel focused on selling the existing inventory of Atari products and creating a new line of computers capable of competing with Apple's Macintosh, the Atari ST. In the late 1980s, Tramiel wanted to design a new series of video game consoles for Atari. This is where Sinclair and Flare Technologies comes into play. Flare Technologies was part of Sinclair, and they started designing a new computer called the Loki. Unfortunately for Flare, the Loki didn't pan out and was cancelled. Flare Technologies was headed by Martin Brennan, Ben Cheese, and John Matheson. Flare started working with Amstrad and developed a system called the Flare 1. The Flare 1 was intended to be a home computer or video game console, but the chipset was actually used in arcade game cabinets for quiz machines. Eventually, the chipset was further developed into the Connex multi-system prototype. This was also cancelled, but caught the eye of Jack Tramiel through its technological capabilities. In 1989, Jack Tramiel contacted Flare Technologies and made a deal to buy Flare Technology and turn it into part of Atari, calling it Flare 2. Tramiel asked them to create a 32-bit and 64-bit game consoles based off of the Flare 1 technology that was used in the Connex. They started work on both the 32-bit, which was the Panther, and the 64-bit Jaguar consoles. Work on the Jaguar console proved to be going a lot faster, advancing further, so the Panther project was cancelled. In 1993, the Jaguar was unveiled at the Chicago Consumer Electronics Show. Also, there was a test launch of the Jaguar, which saw all of the 20,000 units that were shipped be sold. Atari at this point thought that they had a big hit on their hands. Jaguar was launched on November 23, 1993, at a price of $249.99. Most of the games were not very popular, but there were a few games that were good. Tempest 2000, Doom, Wolfenstein 3D, Alien vs. Predator were all released in '93 as well. But as the consoles were starting to sell and people started buying and playing games, one thing came to the forefront. Gamers realized that games did not look like they were on a 64-bit system, and even as low as 16-bit, but most likely 32-bit quality. Consumers started questioning whether the Jaguar was a true 64-bit system. Atari kind of limped along for a couple years until 1995, when the arrival of the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation basically sealed the final nail in the coffin for the Jaguar. But we'll take a quick pause here, and I just want to let you know that there were a few peripherals that were designed for the Jaguar, one being the Pro Controller, giving it additional buttons for fighting games. Then there was the JagLink, which was a network device to connect Jaguars together to be able to play games together. And then, in 1995, they released the Jaguar CD and memory track module. But unfortunately for Atari, this was not enough to save the Jaguar, and by late 1995, rumors started circulating that the Jaguar was going to be discontinued in April of 1996. Atari agreed to merge with JTS Incorporated, and on July 30th of that year, the merger was completed. After the merger with JTS, most of the Jaguar inventory remained unsold and was moved to a private liquidator called Tiger Software in 1996. And in 1998, JTS sold the Atari name and all of its Atari properties to Hasbro, marking the end of Atari as we all knew it after 26 years. Now, a funny tidbit of information about the Atari and JTS is that they ended up selling the console shells to a dental imaging company, where they went ahead and produced an imaging machine using the shells of the Atari Jaguar. Unfortunately, only a few of these were produced as technology changed and the company used different products. So that kind of brings us to the end of the Atari Jaguar story. However, I did want to say in 1998 the Jaguar became an open source system, and with many great homebrew games that have been made for the Jaguar. In fact, the homebrew games tend to be a little bit better than the original Jaguar games that were released by Atari. So if you ever have a chance to check out the homebrew scene on the Jaguar, it's excellent. Now, the Jaguar did not have a very long lifespan. It started in 1993 and was discontinued in 1996, selling less than 150,000 units in total, and being the very last video game console made by Atari. Well, at least the Atari that we all grew up with.
It came from the third dimension, with its own brain, its own voice, its own legs. There's only one problem. It needs your eyes. Virtual Boy. See it now in 3D.
The story of the Nintendo Virtual Boy actually starts in the mid-1980s with the company named Reflection Technology Incorporated. They created a stereoscopic head-tracking prototype called Private Eye, which featured a tank game. Needing funds to support their business ambitions, they went to the Consumer Electronics Show. There, they showed their Private Eye off to several companies including Mattel, Sega, and Hasbro. All those companies declined, but one company in particular showed interest in the Private Eye prototype, and that was Nintendo. Gunpei Yokoi, which was the inventor of the Game & Watch and Game Boy, led engineering R&D 1 group of Nintendo. He thought the oscillating mirror display technology was cutting edge. Negotiations started and Nintendo came to a licensing agreement with Reflection Technology to use their display technology in their new game console. After years of development, the head tracking technology was dropped due to health implications to the people using it, but Nintendo kept the stereoscopic display technology. After several different colors and also a full color display was tested, it was found that the red and black screen was cheaper to produce and easier on the eye for the user. Nintendo predicted the console to be a big seller, even opening a new factory in China specifically for the production of the Virtual Boy. Nintendo predicted over 3 million units sold over Christmas time and over 16 million units of software sold by that time as well. It was debuted at the 1995 E3 and CES shows, but already the reviews were starting to look bad. Many people at the shows that tried out the new console complained of headaches and eye strain. The Virtual Boy was released in Japan on July 21, 1995, and in North America on August 16, 1995, at a price of $179.95. There were 4 launch games that coincided with its release: Mario Tennis, Red Alarm, Telluro Boxer, Galactic Pinball. After its release, there were several complaints from parents about headaches and eye strain from children. Even though the console warned users to take breaks, kids just didn't listen. Imagine that. Sales of the console plummeted. Nintendo tried dire promotions to show off the 3D capabilities as opposed to 2D console games, but this marketing tactic failed as well. After the Christmas season of 1995 and the slow sales of the Virtual Boy, Nintendo decided to discontinue production of the console and games. I'm not really sure the exact date that it was discontinued, but I believe it had about an 11-month lifespan. This was Nintendo's worst console failure, selling only 770,000 units in total.
Are we enjoying ourselves today, folks?
Well, if drinking white wine out of a 4-ounce glass is your idea of enjoyment, see, it's white wine in a 3-ounce glass, red in a 4.
Hey, you with the goatee! 2 words for you, pal. Light and, Frenchie, I need an extension cord and some buffalo wings. Go. Au revoir. Raising the roof with the coot. How you doing? Who's bored? Raise your hand. Anybody? Look who's happy now.
PlayStation.
The PlayStation story starts with Ken Kutungari, or better known as the father of the PlayStation. Kutungari worked behind the scenes with Nintendo to strike a deal to use the SBC 700 sound processor in the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System. But Sony executives found out about this and almost fired him over it, but they decided to keep him on as a protege because the deal was just so damn successful. This started a working relationship with Sony, and Nintendo decided to contract Sony out to build a CD add-on system for the Super Nintendo. Sony was very eager to get into the gaming market because they saw the profit that was being made by Nintendo and Sega at the time. So to secure maximum profits after they developed the SNES CD, or codenamed PlayStation, Sony now was demanding all rights to the games being made on the new CD extension. This would also transfer over to the Super Nintendo cartridges if they were being used in conjunction with the CD system as well. Now, 3 years had went by, and it was 1991 at the CES show. Nintendo was announcing their partnership with Sony to create the CD add-on extension system. Nintendo actually made this announcement, but afterwards struck a deal with Philips to make the CD extension for Nintendo. The next day at the CES show, this was announced. Folks in the gaming world were just shocked by this news, as their partnership had been going on for over 3 years now. It was a total betrayal on Nintendo's part, but Nintendo did not want to lose control over their licensing of their games to another company. Sony and Nintendo continued to work together to supply the chips for the console, but really after this there was no more business done between the two companies, and by this time Sony had developed a standalone version of the PlayStation which was capable of taking Super Nintendo cartridges. But Nintendo would allow them to use it if they wanted and release the console, but Sony actually decided against it because the Sony suits were just kind of rethinking their strategy on the video games. They were really thinking about pulling out of the video game market. But with successful shifting of certain divisions like the music division and then them creating the Sony Computer Entertainment division, they started developing a new PlayStation console with better graphic capabilities such as polygon 3D graphics. And they really wanted to distance this new console from the failed attempt that they had with Nintendo. So the project was called PlayStation X, or PSX. In 1993, Sony decided to go out to several gaming companies to try to promote their new system. Sony at this time didn't have any in-house development, so they had to rely on third-party developers for their games. But the technical details of the PlayStation and how easy it was to basically develop on, several companies decided to jump on board with Sony, including Namco, Konami, and Williams. But Sony needed to have its own in-house development team too. So also in 1993, Sony acquired Psygnosis, and I know all you Amiga guys out there know who Psygnosis is. Psygnosis was later renamed SCE Liverpool. Once Sony purchased Psygnosis, they had a team of over 500 people developing games for them. Although the system was easy to develop for, the development system that Sony had created was not, and the folks at Psygnosis did not like it, and they wanted something that was PC based instead, something that they were familiar with. So Sony teamed up with a company named SN Systems, and they did develop the cards and software for the development system. And with this, there was PC interconnectivity, and being able to program in C and compile in GCC made development very easy. So the PlayStation launched in Japan on December 3rd, 1994, in North America on September 9th, 1995, and in Europe on September 29th, 1995. During and after the launch of the PlayStation, Sony tried a different marketing technique than any other video game manufacturer had tried before. Instead of marketing its game console to kids, it was marketing it towards adults. Sony's logic to this was sound, seeing that a generation of gamers, Generation X basically, that grew up with Atari and Nintendo were now adults and had expendable cash. And by differentiating their console as not being toy-like like the Nintendo or Sega, adults had cash in hand and ready to go ahead and pay for it, while children didn't. And so it made the sale of the PlayStation just skyrocket. Through its lifespan, PlayStation had several different models, most of which looked the same. But in the year 2000, Sony launched the PS1 as a cost-reduced miniature version of the console. It actually outsold the PlayStation 2 for the first 2 years the PlayStation 2 was out. The console enjoyed a successful 12-year run, with it being discontinued in 2006. And basically, it was 102 million units that were sold worldwide, so it definitely made it one of the most successful video game consoles in history.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
Nope.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
Let me check. No.
Is it here yet?
Pokemon Stadium 2 will be here on March 28th. Until then, $10 reserves your copy and gets you a collector's edition poster with tons of Pokemon. So you'll be ready to battle with your gold and silver characters in 3D.
Cool. Is it here yet?
No.
Rated E for everyone.
The story of the N64 really begins in the early 1990s. At this time, Nintendo knew that they would need to start development of a system to replace the Super Nintendo and enter into the next generation of consoles. This is where Silicon Graphics Incorporated, a graphics visualization and supercomputing company, comes into the picture. SGI was looking at expanding their company by putting some of their technology into consumer projects. Jim Clark, founder of SGI, contacted Sega of America and spoke with Tom Kalutsky. Kalutsky was impressed with what he saw, but ultimately Sega did not buy the technology. After Sega engineers evaluated the hardware and technology, they found several issues within it. Or they said. They wanted to own it outright, and SGI was not willing to give up the rights to its own technology. After no deal was struck with Sega, Clark then spoke with CEO of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, in early 1993. Nintendo was willing to license the chipset instead of owning it outright. On August 23, 1993, Nintendo and SGI came to an agreement initiating what would be called Project Reality. Technology from Project Reality would be used in the arcades as soon as 1994 and in the home console market by 1995. Reality Emergent Technology is the name SGI had given its components used in Project Reality. Initially, Project Reality was developed into the Onyx supercomputer, costing $100,000 to $250,000 for the game development system. It was filled with Reality Engine 2 graphic boards and 4 150 MHz RISC CPUs. The APIs were based on Performer and OpenGPL. On June 23, 1994, Nintendo announced the official name of its console as the Ultra 64. Developers started signing on with Nintendo, including Rare, Acclaim, DMA Designs, Ocean, and many more. Around this time, the Project Reality team prototyped the game controller for the system. Basically, they used a SNES controller and added an analog stick with the Z button. This prototype controller eventually became the N64 controller, but the design of this controller was so secretive that once developers were using it, they had to hide it in a box after they were done. While development of the console continued, Nintendo and developers started developing games on the Onyx supercomputer-based development system. Eventually, these systems were replaced by cost-reduced SGI indie workstations, which had a fully accurate console simulation board within the system to help with the ease of development. The console was publicly revealed for the first time in 1994 and showed the console with the Nintendo Ultra 64 logo, a ROM cartridge, but no controller at this time. Also in late 1994, Nintendo started licensing agreements with Midway and Williams to create arcade games based on the Ultra 64. These games were Killer Instinct and Cruising USA. Although the Ultra 64 arcade boards were based on the Ultra 64 game console, they used a different chipset with no reality coprocessor and also used hard drives. Also around this time, Nintendo decided to go ahead and rename the game console from the Ultra 64 to the Nintendo 64. This was based on Konami, who had ownership of the Ultra Games trademark, and Nintendo was afraid that they might be sued over trademark infringement. So the name was changed to the Nintendo 64, or better known as the N64. But a cool tidbit of information is that the software and hardware on the N64 still used the NUS prefix, which stands for Nintendo Ultra 64. Originally, the N64 was slated to be released by the Christmas season of 1995. However, due to hardware problems with the chips underperforming, they had to be redesigned again. The delay went into the spring of 1996. At this time, Nintendo's software development kit was completely redesigned as a Windows-based partner N64 system by Kyoto Microcomputers. On June 23, 1996, the N64 was released in Japan, and on September 26, 1996, released in North America. The console was originally slated to be sold in the US for $250, but the launch price was reduced down to $199.99 to make it competitive with Sony and Sega. Nintendo at this point knew that Sony and Sega had basically sewed up the adult and teen market in video games, so the N64 specifically targeted preteens. The N64 was quite a successful console, selling just under 33 million units worldwide. It was eventually discontinued on April 30th, 2002. This gave the N64 a 6-year lifespan.